Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We are going to go ahead and get started with this webinar on lessons learned from COVID-19. Are there silver linings for biomedical innovation? My name is Esther Krufa, and I serve as Executive Director of Faster Cures as Center of the Milken Institute. We're so pleased to have a fantastic panel of speakers today on such a critical topic to reflect on the lessons that they have and we have been learning as we continue to battle this pandemic together. Some housekeeping matters. Your audio was muted upon entry, but please mute yourself as well so there's no intrusion of background noise. Please feel free to enter your questions that you have during this webinar in the Q&A box. I will try to get to as many of them as possible. We have a short 1 hour time frame, and I know that it will go quickly. Why don't we go on to the next slide? As the COVID-19 crisis has unfolded, policymakers, scientists, and companies have jumped into the fray to develop the tools needed to rapidly combat the virus. And we have seen remarkable innovation in the R&D process born out of necessity. We've seen 3 vaccines, 8 treatments that have received emergency use authorizations, and 1 approval for a treatment. And Faster Cures wants to ensure that the lessons that have been learned in this acceleration with the R&D process is not lost as we go into the future and the current urgency subsides, not only for combating future infectious disease outbreaks, but also conducting every other kind of biomedical R&D. And we certainly all see every day the human toll in suffering and the loss of quality of life and untimely death that comes as a result of thousands of known diseases that have no treatments or cures. So these lessons are quite critical for individuals and caregivers that care about trying to get to solutions for their family members. Through research and over 36 interviews with key opinion leaders from government, industry, academia, and the nonprofit sector, we have identified promising policies and practices that have emerged from the COVID-19 crisis to be preserved and improved upon. And we've begun to explore what needs to be done to maintain and realize those opportunities going into the future. Many of those that we interviewed in a white paper that were released in January around the silver linings of the learnings coming out of COVID-19 are here on this panel today. We identified 20 recommendations in 5 broad areas, and I will cover that in just a bit. If we go on to the next slide. So what lessons have we learned? We have learned some cross-cutting, really important insights through this pandemic. And that while the occasional messiness of scientific inquiry has been on display, has certainly not all gone smoothly, the world is aware like never before that the critical, important investments in biomedical innovation really does impact public health. We have seen important shifts in mindsets, a greater willingness to bring creativity, to speed problem solving, and to set precedents that can be built upon and improved. Some policies put in place by the government, like the Public Health Declaration, will expire, and public health emergencies broadly will end, but we need to advocate strongly for the positive changes to be institutionalized. The emergency gave people license and a sense of urgency to try new approaches. Several innovative technologies, platform technologies, that were already in development were quickly deployed to combat this virus. And we must realize that these behaviors will not magically remain in place. We must do the hard work now to ensure that we have the long-term benefit of realizing these changes in the policies and the way that we run biomedical innovation well into the future. The quote that we have here is reflective of one of the conversations that we had in the course of our interview series, that we're running a series of experiments right now, but we need a systematic approach to figure this out. And if we don't do the hard work right now of learning what we should have learned from COVID, it will be a moment in time where we lost an opportunity to learn, and we do not want to do that. That is the reason for this webinar and these discussions today. If we go on to the next slide, The recommendations from our white paper were in these 5 broad areas: research collaboration, accelerating product development, the clinical trial design and execution, the collection and use of real-world data and evidence, and racial and ethnic disparities. Very quickly at the top, we saw both domestic and international researchers and companies, and many of those collaborations required both companies and in some cases even academic researchers to set aside any kind of competitive behavior to collaborate in unprecedented ways to tackle with speed this urgency of the novel coronavirus. In accelerating product development, faster R&D timelines are due not only to the extraordinary investment of financial and human capital, but also the long-term investments in platform technologies and infrastructure, and the deployment of innovative research designs and approaches, and the regulators' agility, speed, and flexibility. In terms of clinical trial design and execution, we have seen innovations such as master protocols, platform trials, adaptive designs that have shown their value in bringing speed and efficiency to the trial process. The use of remote tools, decentralized approaches to maintaining non-COVID trials have increased during the pandemic. We have seen real progress in the integration and use of real-world data and evidence from disparate sources coming together in faster ways to learn and to develop hypotheses to improve care, and demonstrating the value of randomized real-world evidence. Finally, with racial and ethnic disparities, if nothing else, it's shown through COVID that these long-standing systemic challenges that we've had in our country have been brought to light. We have the attention. What we need are the actions, and we must seize upon this moment to realize real change. So we're pleased to explore these topics and many others in the course of the next 55 minutes or so, and look forward to your questions and comments. With that, I am pleased to introduce really an outstanding panel. First, Dr. Francis Collins, who needs no introduction. He's the director of the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Richard Moshishki, who is the Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President, Science and Regulatory Advocacy at Pharma. Dr. Ellen Siegel, Chairman and Founder of Friends of Cancer Research. Dr. Janet Woodcock, Acting Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Thank you and welcome to all of you. Well, why don't we go ahead and kick off? We have a lot to cover in a short period of time. Francis, I thought I will start with you. As you're reflecting, and I'm sure you've had a number of these conversations, you've been reflecting on your past year at NIH. I would love for you just to share with us what changed at the NIH as a result of the pandemic. What have you seen as positive changes that you would like to see continue into the future?
Well, thanks, Esther, and hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel to talk about the silver linings that we should try to find in what has been an incredibly difficult year. And we should start off by recognizing that and the terrible toll it has taken on more than 500,000 lives in the US and many more globally, as well as all the other distresses that have happened on so many people of economic sorts and health sorts. So we have faced something that we've not really had to deal with for 103 years, and it has been brutal on all of us. And we should recognize the many heroes that have tried to rise to the occasion to do everything they could to try to get us through this. And scientists have been on that list, and I've had the privilege of working with many of those heroic scientists who have tried to bring their best game to this really big challenge. And we have learned a lot in these 12 months. When I think back of where we were exactly a year ago when WHO declared this a global pandemic, I looked across at where we were at that point in terms of therapeutics, and it was a pretty scattershot effort. There was no coordinated effort to try to prioritize which things most ought to get into clinical trials. The clinical trials themselves were not particularly well coordinated and brought together. Master protocols hadn't quite happened. Vaccines were coming along, but not in a fashion that you could really be quite sure how they were going to also be carried out in a way that you could be confident of the results. So one of the things that I've learned in this year is this is a time to get everybody around the same table who has expertise and try to figure out how we could collectively tackle these issues. Not worry about who's going to get the credit, worry about how we can try to save lives. That was then the formation of something called ACTIV, A-C-T-I-V. And people who don't know about that, you can Google it and you'll see a whole lot of information about this, standing for Accelerating COVID-19 Therapeutic Interventions and Vaccines. That ultimately has grown to involve 20 biopharmaceutical companies, multiple NIH institutes, the FDA, the CDC, the Veterans Administration, managed by the Foundation for NIH very capably, and has made it possible for us to come up with strategies to tackle the therapeutic and the vaccine challenges. Master protocols were written. The vaccines that then got tested all pretty much adhered to the same harmonized master protocol. That's why 30,000 was the right number in order to do those trials and make sure you had a sufficient amount of rigor to determine safety and efficacy. And of course, we worked closely with Operation Warp Speed, which was another major invention here to try to make sure that not only were we supporting the most rigorous trials, that manufacturing was being thought about and paid for upfront at risk so that there wouldn't be a long gap after a successful vaccine trial. My colleague Janet Woodcock, who's on this panel, can tell you a whole lot more about Operation Warp Speed, given her very significant role there leading the therapeutic part of that. So ACTIV did set up and put in place no less than 5 master protocols, adaptive so that they could be flexible, and then set up a process for prioritizing the more than 600 therapeutics that people had suggested might be beneficial for COVID-19, most of them repurposing from other uses. And that was a rigorous process that ultimately settled upon the therapeutics that were thought to have the greatest chance of opportunity. Of course, that grew to include such things as monoclonal antibodies, for which there has now been considerable progress, especially in terms of showing their benefit for outpatients, not so much for inpatients. On top of all that, we had diagnostics to think about. And NIH actually did get asked to play a role in that space in terms of coming up with new technologies that would allow point of care diagnostics that could give answers in minutes instead of days. We were asked by the Congress to initiate that kind of program. I could tell you a lot more about it, but it basically turned us into a venture capital organization where we put together what we called a Shark Tank and invited those individuals who had invented new kinds of technologies, some of them nucleic acids, some of them antigen-based, some of them very creative indeed, to bring their ideas forward and see whether, with a very rigorous evaluation from a business and technology and engineering and manufacturing and all those other perspectives, this could be something that would scale. And now today we have 28 of those technologies that have been scaled up and are collectively contributing about 2.5 million tests a day, most of them point of care. That was a new experience for us. So to sum it up, one other thing I should say that we learned as far as the trials is that we had to work even harder than we had been prepared to do on diversity of enrollment. And I'd love to talk more about that in the course of this panel, because that's a really important issue, especially considering that COVID-19 hit certain groups particularly hard, and therefore all the more important that those groups should be engaged in the trials of vaccines and therapeutics and diagnostics. But that is not necessarily something you just snap your fingers and make happen. We learned a lot about that could be also applied going forward. So I would say NIH will never be the same. The lessons that we learned in the course of this 12 months are things that we will now be in a position to be able to do going forward in perhaps less emergent situations. And we certainly don't want to find ourselves in the future unprepared for the next pandemic, because we're pretty sure there's going to be one. We don't know when, we don't know which virus or which other pathogen, but we know it's out there. So thanks. That was a long answer, but you asked a question that needed a long answer. Thanks.
Yes, well, no, I appreciate that answer. And we'll come back to those topics, particularly with ACTIV and RADx, and how do we repurpose potentially those platforms with the fantastic learnings that you've had using them for COVID, and of course on the racial and ethnic disparity question as well. Why don't I go over to you, Janet? We've been in this pandemic a little over a year now, and you've had a role through Operation Warp Speed, but you're now back at FDA in an acting capacity. We'd love for you to reflect over the last year, what's your single greatest lesson learned through all of this in terms of both FDA's response, but potentially also your role at Operation Warp Speed?
Well, I think the greatest lesson learned is something, we just published the database on this in Nature Drug Discovery. We at FDA and then Warp Speed put together the inventory of trials. So what was the clinical trial ecosystem globally? What was their response to COVID? And how is that working? And what we discovered is that only 5% of trial arms of trials that were registered and ongoing were both randomized and adequately powered to yield actionable information. So there was a tremendous amount of duplication, a lot of small trials, investigator instigated trials that yielded basically tantalizing information that sent people off here and there using treatments that potentially were not useful and potentially harmful. And I think the bottom line lesson of that particular learning is that, we need to have, in global emergency, we need to have more central coordination. Because we should really randomize the first patient when something like this happens and learn from every single person. We could learn much, much faster. And I have to say the second thing, because this relates to something I've been pushing on for a long time, which is what we discovered, and this included the active trials and other trials that were done, and it relates to what Francis said, is that if we don't have research infrastructure in the community where people get their health care, where they are used to going, then we're not going to reach those communities in an emergency, because you cannot just build up infrastructure capacity in the middle of a pandemic. And one of the reasons we could not reach those populations as well as everyone desired is that they didn't have the clinical trials infrastructure support, the research personnel, the investigators didn't have training, they hadn't been doing research because they hadn't been supported in doing research. And so I know Ellen will reflect on this, but we have to move clinical research out in the community, and we have to support that if we're going to be successful, I think, in any way of enrolling populations who reflect this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those were great comments, Janet. And I'm sure there's a greater awareness across the country, probably across the world, of what clinical research is, what clinical trials are, and how can you participate in those clinical trials. And the data that you just shared is quite sobering, which will help us to talk about what we need to do differently to realize that vision of research closer to the community and higher quality clinical trials. So thank you for sharing that.
Right. Well, the answer, for most people is you can't participate in a clinical trial, and that's wrong. Okay. And I agree with you. The higher quality, especially reflecting diversity, then we have to do that outreach and do research in the community if we're going to achieve that.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Rich, let me bring you into the conversation. The private sector and biopharma has played a leading role in the response to COVID-19 as well, bringing their resources and capabilities and skill sets to bear. And it's quite a triumph for science, if you think about it. What are the positive developments that you have seen in the course of the response to COVID-19? But we should also be aware that clinical research outside of COVID-19 was also impacted. So we'll love to talk about that from your perspective.
Well, first off, thanks very much for the opportunity to join this very distinguished panel. I think these are really important questions, and these are issues that we have been tackling also for the past year to not only think about how to address the pandemic, but also what can we take back from it and put into the future. So I think the story in industry is one that you have to use the overused word unprecedented. It really began perhaps though with the preparation with investment in innovation by both the private sector and the public sector, and partnering between those two engines of innovation to really lay and set the table for the use of these kind of technologies that really gave us a leg up in being able to address the pandemic in a quick way. It was the R&D ecosystem at its very best.
Yeah.
We really saw each part of that ecosystem step up and play very important roles with rigor and vigor, both, I think, on all fronts. And the reason that the public sector could afford to do that, where it was in fact that we had incentives in place now for quite some time in our R&D ecosystem that allowed people to prepare and be at the right place at the right time when this happened. But I think what then really took off quickly was collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
You saw companies that are fierce competitors put that aside very quickly to work with each other, to work alongside, and to share. And not just with each other, but also with the NIH and with FDA and with regulators around the world. We really saw a coming together of this ecosystem that produced the incredible results that you highlighted when you began, Esther. And those are things that I think we really want to try and find the best ways to carry that forward. I mean, the data sharing, for example, something that had been a prickly subject for a long time was no longer a prickly subject. We were sharing protocols with each other. We were sharing preclinical data, animal models, and we were then sharing actual patient level data for placebos and even for treatment through platforms like Transcelerate, which was a collaboration and is a collaboration of 20 different companies to set forward that kind of a platform. I think that this kind of scientific partnership continued all the way, not only as companies came together to create the products, they also came together to manufacture those products. And we've seen also an unprecedented willingness to share manufacturing facilities, repurpose them quickly, work with FDA to get those facilities repurposed. I think this has been just a very remarkable time. And what can we carry forward out of that? I hope we continue to think about how to organize ourselves around some of society's most critical illnesses that go beyond the pandemic. And how do we prepare for the next pandemic in a way that doesn't take setting up active all over again, for example. But, I think the power of these platform trials often, in fact, comes from the fact that if you can plug into them quickly, because I'm sure Francis can recognize that it takes time to set them up. And so having them ready to go, I think will make a difference in the future as well.
Well, a lot for us to unpack there, Rich, and I look forward to coming back and doing that with you, but thank you for offering those comments. Ellen, as we think about the impact of COVID-19, it's been felt widely, not just with those who are suffering, and Francis really spoke to that, right? The human suffering that we've all experienced from those who had COVID, but other conditions as well. What has been the experience of individuals with cancer and their care during this time?
Well, it has been really challenging, but first I want to start by thanking you for asking me to be here with these amazingly distinguished people that have dedicated their entire lives to making a difference. I've heard Janet Woodcock for over 20 years tell everyone cancer trials, all trials have to be in the community where patients live. And maybe now we can make that happen. The experience for cancer patients has been, they are very vulnerable for COVID-19. Many of them, people of color, underserved communities, they have been disproportionately hurt, and it has been incredibly challenging. A recent AACR report found that compared to patients without cancer, cancer patients with COVID-19 are twice as likely to die. So this is a really startling number. We've seen a sharp decrease in clinical trial enrollment. At one point, 50% Routine preventative screening plummeted. Screening for cancer of the cervix, colon, and breast were down between 86% and 94% at the start of the pandemic. I'm sure that's better now, but I'm sure it's not where it was. This will have a profound and long-term clinical implication for new cancers or getting diagnosed at a later stage when cancers are most difficult to treat and survival rates are at their lowest. So the impact for cancer and cancer patients, and certainly minorities, underserved populations, has been profound on this. They have paid a huge price, and hopefully later on we'll talk about new things that are happening that will change that equation, but it has been very, very challenging.
Yeah, Ellen, before we come back to those other questions, I would love your perspective from the research perspective of cancer researchers. What has been the impact of COVID-19 for the cancer research community as they've had to potentially pivot, or there's been challenges with enrollment? Can you talk about that?
It's extremely complicated because many new trials have not started. Certainly people were not willing to go to major centers. They were delayed. People that were doing research in labs, many of them weren't even able to get to their labs. Somehow over time, this has worked out, and in fact, has been adjusted, and through NIH and through the creativity of the academic centers, that has gotten a lot better. We're asking new questions and difficult questions, but everyone has been impacted. Researchers for sure, the enterprise of cancer research, but patients. It's patients that really have been impacted, because if we don't have new learnings, if we don't have new trials, if they don't have access to the best treatments, this is a huge, huge burden on them, and COVID has made it much harder and made many of them not go to appointments, but there have been adjustments. Researchers have been able to adjust the clinical trials. We've been able to look at lab values. We've been able to look at labs in the community. So there have been changes and some innovation has happened, but for sure, a big price and a lot of learnings. But hopefully my next portion will be more positive about things that we've learned and things that we can do.
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll come back to that. Francis, you touched on during your comments on the role of active and RADx. Rich alluded to the fact that how do we redeploy platforms for critical illnesses? When you think about maybe a year from now, or look around the corner when this pandemic is well under control, we've all gotten vaccinated. How can we deploy these assets that so much resources, human resources and financial resources have gone into? How can we think about prioritizing critical illnesses, leveraging this infrastructure that NIH has built out?
Well, we're thinking a lot about that. Maybe I'll mention 3 areas that I think could be really quite useful in terms of lessons learned and perpetuation of those structures into applications beyond the pandemic. One would be to be sure that we maintain this public-private partnership opportunity that we've had working on COVID-19, really bringing together the appropriate experts around the same table. And this is the active partnership. And again, Rich Majewski, many thanks to the way in which the members of pharma have rallied to this and not really worried too much about what normally would have been a lot of legal constraints that might have taken years to sort out. If we could do it in 2 weeks, as we did forming Active, we probably could do that again without having too many lawyers in the room and make those kinds of partnerships happen when we need them much more transparently and readily. A second area, and Janet has alluded to this, now we had to come to grips with the fact that our clinical trial networks in the United States anyway are pretty disconnected. She reported on just how many trials were being done that really weren't going to add much to knowledge because they were too small, they were poorly powered, they were duplicative. Happy to say most of those were not funded by NIH, but they were getting funded in networks that we probably support as far as the infrastructure. One of the things we did for COVID-19 was to really get an inventory of what are those large-scale, well-run clinical trial networks, both from NIH, many of them run through academic centers, but also from industry in terms of CROs, so that we could try to bring to bear the full power of the well-designed networks at a time where we needed them. And that's how we got active 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Those are all master protocols to actually go and to go pretty well. But it didn't happen as easily as you might have wanted it to. We cannot let this clinical trial ecosystem fall back into this scattershot approach, or we'll be sorry. We need to have a much more rigorous approach now to how we do these kinds of things. And if you needed the evidence, we now have it. So let's be sure we learn from that. Third, I mentioned this RADx approach, which was a venture capital strategy that I would not have guessed would go as well as it did. And I think we want to use that same model going forward for a variety of other applications. It was particularly good for technology development, and maybe that'll be the place where we want to use it. Think, for instance, wouldn't you really like to have a good competition for an ambulatory wearable blood pressure measurement that could be used to monitor people with hypertension, so you actually know whether you've got their control right or not, because most of the time you're just kind of guessing. There's a lot of technologies out there. What if we ran a Shark Tank for that one? That would be pretty interesting. And you can make your own list of the kinds of things that would be well suited for that and are not very well suited for the typical NIH grant process that takes at least a year before you get any money to get started. RADx, it was more like 2 weeks. So that kind of mindset we're going to carry forward.
That's great. Let me go to Janet with an audience question. I did mention in our prep for this, I'll try to bring in those questions as quickly as possible. One question in terms of what your vision is for more community-centered research. An audience member asked, well, how can real-world evidence and real-world data help build that kind of research infrastructure, particularly used to reach communities that are underserved and or hesitant in participating in the research enterprise? And then how can FDA and other federal agencies build out the collection and use of real-world evidence and real-world data?
Well, there is work going on, and Ellen would know that, through the Reagan-Udall Foundation to work on real-world evidence in the COVID space. So certainly the FDA is interested in that and working on it. But I regard the providing a clinical research infrastructure and running clinical research in the community as a separate issue. We are working very hard with a variety of partners to try and run studies off of the electronic health record rather than having separate case report forms. This simplifies and enables other parties who are busy and involved mainly in clinical care to participate. But these trials have to be more pragmatic. They can't have like dozens of researchy type of activities associated with them, but there are hundreds of important questions that need to be answered about clinical care that could be, studies like this could be used for. Now, so the real world evidence really would be running the study and taking the data off of the electronic health record rather than requiring all kinds of separate work by the practitioners. We still need infrastructure and training because you need to consent patients, you need support for the community to do this. And I know there is some hesitancy, but I don't think we can really talk about hesitancy until we've actually set up research infrastructure in the communities where the people are getting care, and then see if they're offered trials by their own practitioners, do they turn them down versus having to go to a medical center somewhere and get enrolled. So I think the issue is, can we set up pragmatic enough trials and infrastructure support that could enable community practitioners who are taking care of patients to actually participate? And there are CROs that work on this and provide the support. So the question is, where can the funding come that would support this kind of ongoing activity?
Mm-hmm. And before we go to Ellen to maybe respond on the question of the real world evidence and real world data and what you have seen come out of the Reagan-Udall Foundation that could be applicable, people are curious, Janet, what has been the impact of COVID internally within FDA? And what kind of support does the agency need, whether through appropriations or user fees, to manage that impact going forward in terms of the shift in practices in the clinical trials?
Well, it's been much more complicated than that, really. The burden on a couple of the medical product centers, devices, drugs, and biologics has been tremendous on the review process. We've got hundreds and hundreds of INDs on top of the ordinary workload, these vaccines coming in and having to be reviewed quickly. Hundreds of diagnostic EUAs have been granted, and they have all the PPE. And yet all the those FDA centers have also had to deal with the supply chain issues, because all these, right now we're facing a pipette tip shortage that's very serious, all right? And it sounds like impossible, but that is actually the case. And so FDA has gotten much more involved in the details, downstream details of the supply chain for different products than it has been in the past. That really hasn't been FDA's role to that extent. Of course, many modifications have been made. For example, the centers have put out a number of guidances on how to do remote visits, how to keep clinical trials going in the face of COVID, minimize the number of in-person visits and so forth and so on, and many other, how to comply with the regulations and so forth. So that also has been put out. And then pharmacovigilance for these products and monitoring their safety and continued effectiveness has been a real issue. And I'm not done yet, okay? So we just put out 3 guidances on the variants. We're already seeing the variants affect the monoclonal antibodies and the diagnostics to a little bit. We don't think there'll be clinical impact at this time on vaccines, but we don't know what the future will hold, and we have to monitor that. So those are extremely important activities. And then there's a whole range of additional things, which is the inspections. Our people, we inspect the food supply, the drug, device, and veterinary drug supply, and biologics and so forth. And we've not been able to go on those inspections. We had inspectors recently, they had to do a 2-week quarantine in another country and just sitting in a hotel room for 2 weeks, each one of them separate, until they could actually be released by that country to go and do the mission critical inspection. So our inspections have been really impacted, and we're going to have to do a recovery phase where we get back and overseeing these industries and so forth. So the FDA has had an extremely wide range of impacts from this.
Yes, I think sometimes we fail to appreciate the full breadth of the responsibilities that FDA holds and how these trickle-down effects really go across the entirety of the programs with which you oversee. Ellen, I do want to come back to you to give us a little bit of the positive news on what have you seen in terms of the use of real-world evidence and data with regard to learnings that are coming out of these COVID-19 research efforts that we can carry into the future, but also I'd love for you to comment on the innovation that has come out of cancer research that's useful for COVID-19, was useful for this, but also could be beneficial going forward, that was accelerated during this time. Maybe just talk a little bit about the innovation piece, but also RWE and RWD.
I would like to start with the foundations that both the NIH, FDA, and actually CDC have. They have become incredibly useful. I would suggest that all of the work on COVID that is going on now would not be possible. These were set up by Congress, and they were to really facilitate public-private partnerships and the ability to expand the networks that already exist in a much more facile way. And certainly Francis has talked about active and warp speed. And at FDA, the evidence accelerator, who really was the brainchild of Amy Abernathy, but with great support from Janet and from Jeff Shoren and all the directors, really done extraordinary work on real world evidence. The trick here is to get it right. There's an urgency to get the answers, but there also is an urgency to get it right and how to handle that. We have growing recognition of the importance. We have all the leaders working together. We have the VA, we have Gates, we have all data aggregators asking very important questions in a uniform way, so we can have the ability to answer them and feel confident in those answers. We have 3 tracks. We have one with drugs. It took us a while to get it right because we are very anxious to get this. We understand the urgency, but we also understand if it's not right, it will not be of any use. So we have really been working on that. And I think we now have it right and have the urgency right and the ability to trust what we're getting out of that. We certainly have that on drugs. We're doing that on diagnostics. It is really complicated on diagnostics because of codes and other things, but with great support from Jeff Shoren and the agency on that. And we also have our lab meetings where we get to share information from people all over the world, and we have learnings, and we are now starting on vaccines, and there's a huge amount that we have learned. So I'm very pleased that these foundations are useful to both the NIH and the FDA, and I will have a little plug. They are underfunded, and we have to find a way to get them more funding because they are of great utility, and they've done a lot of things. I do want to talk about innovations. We all know about master protocols. They are incredibly important. They are not new to cancer. We've been doing them for a long time, but we're learning a lot. The Lung Map, which is a public-private partnership done through the FNIH, is really interesting because here we are in the community. We're at over 500 sites. We're dealing with a refractory population. It's a trial that really deals, that's a registration intent. And we've hardly missed a beat on that because we are in the community, but we need more of them, and we need adaptive trials and innovative trials. Certainly the OCE, the Office of Oncology, Rick Pastor has been doing incredible things on RTOR and have been saving times. This is, really things that are important for us to share information. The real-time review has been incredibly successful for COVID-19, and we're growing recognition of real world evidence and what it really means, and also exclusionary criteria, getting the right people in these trials. This is something we've been working on with ASCO. So I think there's a lot happening in this space, and we're learning to be more facile. We're learning to work with the community, and we're also learning to really see what we can do on the infrastructure and the speed of getting these things up, because they're urgent, and we have to answer urgent questions that are really important to patients.
Mhm.
Let me jump in and endorse what Ellen just said about the critical contributions of the foundations. And certainly what I've been talking about in terms of what we've done with therapeutics and vaccines, we would never have been able to make the kind of progress we did through ACTIV without the Foundation for NIH and their remarkable skill set, and also the experts we brought in from Deloitte to assist with that. That has just been critical. When the story gets written about what happened with COVID-19, there ought to be a whole chapter about this particular set of contributors because they have been astounding. Let me also say, I'm really glad, Ellen and Janet, the focus on real world evidence, but also making sure that when we say that, we still mean design has to be done carefully, because real world evidence is not just a green light to do any old sloppy thing that you want to do and say, well, it's real world, so it's okay. And we can all look at examples where that hasn't turned out as well. Somebody should write the story about convalescent plasma and how we still here in March of 2021 aren't quite sure what the role really should be for what could have been one of the things that we would maybe have learned early on if we'd had it properly put forward in the kind of design trials that we somehow didn't manage to get initiated. So a lesson there. Anyway,
Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry to jump in.
I'd like to add one little word to that, because you're right. We deal with urgency, speed, but accuracy and trust are important too. And how to get the balance, how to do that is really the challenge.
Well, I was going to comment on that, which is the fact that having taken that time, you do have the ability to trust, as you mentioned, what is coming out of that. that gives the foundation when people talk about what's the quality of the data, the standardization of data, how do we aggregate in a way that we can make meaningful sense, that we're talking about apples to apples, not apples to oranges. All of that work really will pay off in the long term. Rich, I want to come back to you and really ask this question that really we have seen a lot of interest, a lot of activity, a lot of movement, which is that there was significant use of telehealth services, telemedicine, whatever the term you want to address it by, to help people get access to care. But those same tools, including remote monitoring and these other kinds of innovative technologies, have allowed us to contemplate a future where we might see more decentralization of trials. I think it feeds back into what Janet talked about of making trials closer to the communities, but also bringing other participants into the communities. Can you talk a little bit about the innovation with regard to the decentralization of clinical trials? How do we think about that going forward as part of our clinical trial ecosystem?
Yeah, thank you, Esther. I'm really excited to talk about it because that may be also one of the great lessons learned. You know, COVID was such a crucible where emerging practices that we've talked about today already could readily and almost imperatively had to be adopted. And I think these facets of decentralized trials is clearly one of those. And it will change the clinical research paradigm to some degree, or at least the enterprise and how we think about it today. You know, we had a generation of new products at risk. Clinical trials were stopped. Clinical trials were put on hold. Clinical trials were not even begun during this period of time because of the closure of clinical trial sites, which is the basis of our current clinical trial enterprise. And this was devastating, and even more devastating were clinical trials that had already enrolled hundreds of patients for new products, were already well underway and difficult to stop at that point, were truly in trouble. So this ability to turn to the digital technologies, I mean, after all, this is the third decade of the 21st century, that we could take these kind of digital approaches and actually bring the trials to the patients without necessarily through the clinical trial sites themselves. So through the use of telemedicine, virtual visits to the patients in their homes, the ability to send medications to their homes or visiting nurses to the homes, the ability to do remote monitoring, because remember, even good clinical trial conduct requires sponsors to carefully monitor those trials, but they couldn't travel anymore. They couldn't even get in planes to go to the clinical trial site. So remote monitoring became really an important facet of how to do this. And even getting new patients into those trials to finish the enrollment through electronic consent was another really important feature that we could employ here. And so, you know, suddenly these trials were viable. And today, 76% of sponsors are using these types of approaches. And so it's really something that has taken off and more than doubled since 2019 through 2020 in how we're approaching clinical trial conduct. And I think this will have not only benefits for speed of trials, for how to set them up, I think and the benefit will be for the patient. And for the patient not often having to make long distance trips or even in some cases resettling to be close to clinical trial sites. I think it can truly make a great difference for us. It may even help us access those communities that have been underserved and often find it difficult to get access to clinical trials. Which brings me to another really important issue, and that is diversity in our clinical trials. And I think that became very apparent early on that despite many efforts over many years, we've struggled to achieve it. And I think on that front, industry itself has really been galvanized in a way that never had before in this past year. I'm sure you're aware that, for example, our member companies of pharma have all now signed on to new principles for their own individual conduct and design of clinical trials to emphasize the components that are necessary to increase diversity. And we're quite committed this year to trying to find the right way to launch a public-private partnership that will do exactly what Janet has said we need to do, and that is build a sustainable, community-based infrastructure for clinical research.
Excellent.
Great comment. And in fact, that's exactly the direction I wanted to go next. So thank you for teeing that up. Janet, I'd love for you to react to that, both the idea of, can decentralization of trials bring more participants? Can it bring more diverse participants? How do we change our clinical trial enterprise to allow for increased diversity, particularly when agencies like yours regulate global companies? How do we achieve these goals?
Well, first, let me say, CDER publishes every year the snapshots, and those are for the efficacy trials of the different novel drugs and new molecular entities. And the snapshots show the demographic data from those pivotal trials. And what it has shown is, there were many discussions that women were underrepresented. And right now, women are not underrepresented except in a very narrow niche, which is some cardiovascular trials. And to our an investigation of that has more to do with referral to the trial, not exclusion or inclusion criteria or anything like that. But that's something for the cardiologists to sort out, okay? But what the snapshots does show is that we still have a huge problem in diversity and representation in the trials that are done by the industry. These are generally industry trials. And often, of course, they're multinational trials, so we may have representation from all over the world. But if the trial is done, say, in Russia and Eastern Europe, then we're not going to have very much diversity. If trials that are done in the United States or the US portion of trials really don't reflect the diversity of the US population. And so I'm really glad to hear from Rich that is moving forward, because I believe both government and industry need to band together, and maybe a PPP is a way to do it, and provide sustainable trial personnel and training to investigators who are in the community. And that isn't just underserved, but people, we had tens of thousands of people dying from COVID, and we couldn't get patients enrolled because we didn't have enough sites, right? And even if the major medical center had a site going, they were integrated, their network sites out in the community didn't have trained personnel. They didn't have study personnel. And so they couldn't, get the study up and going. This is not something, as somebody said, it's not something you can do on a dime. You have to build a sustainable infrastructure. But to your point and to your question, simplifying trials will really help. And there's a tremendous number of questions that we need to ask about provision of healthcare in the United States and what kind of treatment policy you should use for any given disease. And so such pragmatic community-based trials are ideal to answer those sorts of questions. And they could be used also for pivotal trials or a portion of the pivotal trials for investigational drugs, but it has, and devices and so on, but they have to be simple enough. Not that I'm saying the community researchers are going to be simplistic, they just won't have time, okay? And they won't have the extensive laboratory backup and all that sort of stuff that people at the medical centers do. So we will have to, for this sustainable infrastructure, we're going to need to make sure there are pragmatic trials, of which there's thousands of questions that need to be answered, right? That pragmatic trials can go on, and that we provide sustainable funding for what's needed to help these community practitioners participate.
And if we make those changes successfully, when we're not in wartime, we will be prepared when we are. And particularly frustrating that we have thousands of people dying in sites that are not ready to enroll for all those various reasons that you mentioned. Ellen, I'd love for your reaction before I come to Francis in terms of this question around diversity, equity in cancer research, cancer trials. How do you see those impacts? How is that community banding together to solve for this challenge? And maybe one final question while I have you. You talked about in a recent op-ed that if we captured the spirit and urgency of COVID-19 research to cure cancer, my goodness, what could we see? And then what could we see if we brought more people into the fold?
We have to get real patients, people where they live. People, when they have a diagnosis of cancer, almost always are in the community and almost always are not offered a trial. So we have to have trials that are meaningful, people in communities where people can enroll in them. And we have to ask what the patients want. What are their goals? Is it toxicity? Is it quality of life? Is it, are they willing, what trial is meaningful to the patient? So there are a lot of questions that we're not asking, but for sure we have to get patients who are older, people in diverse communities, people underserved communities. They have to be simple, they have to be meaningful, and they are part of the ecosystem. If we can't figure that out, we are never going to get real world data on patients, and it's crucial. And I, like Janet and Francis, believe very strongly we can do that. We've started to do some of this in the lung map, but we can do more. We just have to train the physicians. We have to give them the ability to make it easy and ask questions that are meaningful. So I'm incredibly optimistic we can get it done. There's an urgency because these are the patients that are really being hurt. These are the patients that are dying. These are the patients that don't have options, and they may have options that would make a huge amount of difference. And we can do this in cancer, and I'm very optimistic about it. I do want to mention something that I failed to mention earlier on the COVID Accelerator. It is a partnership with the Reagan-Udall Foundation in collaboration with Friends of Cancer Research, Friends of Cancer Research, and Jeff would kill me if I didn't mention that, and FDA that has been incredibly important. So I think that we can be more agile in all of this. I'm very optimistic that we can come together and make very major changes. We can stop working in silos, impact patients that really need the help where they live, and make a difference in their lives. So I think we've learned a lot. We've suffered a lot, but there's a lot that we can take home and now deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Francis, you get the last word, at least for the panel, and then I will close this out. NIH recently announced an effort, I believe called Unite, to address and end structural racism and disparities in biomedical research. Quite a bold effort. Could you describe what that is intended to do, and how do we solve this problem of lack of diversity, not only in clinical trials, but just medical research in general?
It is a bold effort, but it's overdue. We recognize, as many other parts of this country did in the course of the last 12 months and well before that, that we are still in a place where structural racism is a component of how our communities operate. Certainly the killing of George Floyd brought that into sharp relief and attention, but there were many other examples of that perhaps many of us had not really thought hard enough about to ask ourselves, how does this affect our institutions as well? And when we did that, we had to admit that the way in which biomedical research operates also is contaminated by these structural racist attitudes that have been there for 400 years. So we are making a commitment to do several things. And one of them is to look at our own workforce and try to understand why we have not been seen as very welcoming to people of diverse backgrounds, and what can we do about that. You're going to see a lot of changes in our efforts to try to recruit and retain individuals from different backgrounds, because that is how productivity happens. This isn't just a nice thing to do. It's a critical thing to do if we're going to be good stewards of the public trust. And of course, it also plays out in terms of the research portfolio and talking about diversity and enrollment. Just a very specific example is the vaccine trials that we all worked on so hard over the course of the last 12 months. I can't tell you how many Saturday mornings I spent, probably at least 15 or 16 of them, meeting with the leadership of the companies that were running those trials, trying to do what we could to boost up the participation of diverse individuals, because it was not going well at the beginning for most of these. And it took a very specific commitment at the top level of all of those organizations and a willingness to spend more money and perhaps even slow down a little bit in terms of the hell-bent for leather timetables that we were trying to meet in order to end up with trials that actually looked like the country. So people could look at the trial and say, I see myself in there. I see that people like me benefited from this vaccine as well. We got there. Many of these trials now with 35, 37% diversity, which is pretty unheard of, but it was hard work. And it involved building an alliance called SEAL, the Community Engagement Alliance, from which many lessons could be learned. And this was said right at the beginning, I think, by many of you. You've got to have the infrastructure for that kind of community engagement at the start. You don't build that on the fly. At least it's not going to work very well. You have to invest in that. We have to remember that lesson going forward, not just for the next pandemic, but for everything we do.
That's a great place to end. I want to thank all of you. I know that the days are busy. Your work is incredibly important. We thank you for your service on behalf, not just of this country, but the world as we're getting through this pandemic. And there's certainly, as we've talked about today, a lot of lessons for us to learn. The hard part is implementing these lessons in a sustainable way well into our policies and our infrastructure and our mindsets and our culture so that patients benefit at the end of the day. So thank you all very much for spending this hour together to surface these really important questions and considerations, and have a great rest of the day to our audience.
Thank you, Esther.
Thank you.